So now that we have some basic criteria to determine whether the enemy can see the player based on proximity or range, based on an angle or field of view, and then including the line of sight, we can start to establish some basic behaviors based on different criteria, whether we determine that the enemy is aware of the player or should pursue the player or fire upon the player or do whatever. What we're going to do is we're going to take these three basic criteria and pass information up to our parent game object. And for now, we're just going to set a couple of bool variables to determine whether we have a range, whether we're in range, whether we are within our field of view, and whether we're in line of sight. Excuse me. So we'll do that. We'll kick things off by starting with our parent object for the enemy, and I'm going to add a state machine. And for now, this FSM is, I'll call this enemy AI manager or enemy behavior manager or whatever we want to, determine this should be called. And I'm going to establish a couple of different variables. So I'll start by jumping into the variables tab, and these are all going to be bools. Now we could do this a lot of different ways. We'll use bools to determine what the behavior should be, but this could certainly be a little bit more complex. It doesn't have to be absolute as to whether things are true or false. In fact, we could give each one of these criteria, the range, field, and line of sight, an index number or a value that plays out in a behavior index, so that depending on how many of these conditions are true, different behaviors happen. But we'll start off with bools first. And so the first bool that I'm going to create is, I'll simply call it range. And so this will determine we're either in range or out of range. And in fact, I could include in range, but the definition I'm going to use here is that if it's in range, it'll be true, and if it's out of range, it'll be false. And so I'll let all of these start off as false. The next bool is going to be our field of view. So I'll just call this FOV. Same thing, I'll let it default to false. And if we get in the field of view, we'll set it to true and then back to false if we're not. And then we'll do line of sight. So I'll call this LOS. So I'm abbreviating these. Now, if that gets a little confusing, a lot of times it might make sense to spell these variables out in long form. But should be able to determine pretty quickly what these abbreviations are. Again, they're all starting out as false. And we'll do a little bit of switching over here later once we determine what's happening. But let me just jump back in these variables for just a second. So for debugging purposes, what I'll do is I'm going to make these bools available in the inspector. So I'm in the variable tab and I'm just selecting these individual variables and I'm flipping them on in the inspector. And that'll, when we have our enemy with AI object selected, we'll be able to see those current values. And that'll help us with debugging. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into the rangefinder. So we have two different states here. We have out of range and in range. And basically what we want to do is we want to set the bool for our enemy with AI, our range bool. We want it set to false if we're out of range and set to true if we're in range. And rather, we're not going to just do a straight set bool. What we'll do is we're going to go into the state machine category. And we want to set FSM bool. So somewhere in here, there it is. Nope, that's get. Let's try that again. Somewhere down here, again, alphabetical order. There it is, set FSM bool. So I'll double click. The game object that we want to set the bool for is not the owner, because the owner is this rangefinder. We want to set the enemy with AI. So what we'll do is we'll specify a game object. We can do this dynamically, but because this hierarchy is going to stay intact, there's really no harm, even if we prefab this, there's no harm with just dragging that direct relationship in, because it'll just find its parent and that relationship will be maintained. We want to look specifically at the FSM that contains that bool. And so there's only one FSM, it's the enemy with AI manager. And now it'll give us access to all the bools on that object. So we are setting the range. So I'll select that. So when we're out of range, we want to keep this unchecked. That's true. So we'll keep it unchecked. We'll go over to the range. When we're in range, we'll do the same thing. We'll set for a specific object. It's our enemy. The FSM name is the enemy AI manager. We'll go to range, and then we'll set this as true. We'll do the same thing for field of view. So when we're out of range, we'll specify a game object. The game object is going to be the parent object. We'll find the AI manager. And this time around, we're doing the FOV, the field of view. And we'll leave it set to false. Now this time around, I'm going to copy this action to save a little bit of the workflow. We'll go to in field of view, and we'll paste our action. And then we'll just flip the set value. Now, we have an init phase, so I'm not so worried about that. We're going to flow right through. But we're explicitly setting our set FSM bool for our parent object, or the enemy with AI. Okay. We'll jump over to line of sight, and we'll do the same thing. So we'll start with setting our FSM bool. Where'd it go? Did it go? I don't see it. Try it again. Set FSM, there we go. We'll specify a game object. We'll do the enemy AI. Enemy AI manager, and we're doing LOS, line of sight. I'm going to copy that action. We'll paste the action, and we'll set it to true. Now, in this case, I'm going to do a little additional to account for a bug. We're going to add this action somewhere else. So right now we have this loop. At the end of the last presentation, originally, our start state was on this line of no line of sight. This no line of sight is casting array, okay? So is the line of sight. They're both casting rays. It's just one is out of sight, one is in sight, or one is out of line of sight and one is in. I'll get this out, I promise. It's in the line of sight. I've added a third state that says ray is off. And the idea here is that we just have an empty state with no action in it. And if we set that as the start state, that's equivalent to turning off our array. So when we start, we won't be casting array. We won't cast array until we get to this loop. Okay? Now I can foresee a situation with the basic strategy here. Go back to the line of sight here and get this locked. The basic strategy here is that we're going to take the player, and when we move into this area and we have proximity and we have angle of view, this is when we're most interested to determine if we have line of sight. We don't need to constantly figure it out. So what we'll do is we'll kind of kick this over and run this little loop if we're within proximity. So when we're not in proximity, we'll kick it over to the ray is off, and therefore we won't be casting array anymore, and it'll be nice and efficient. Okay, so that's the basic strategy here. So we're setting the bool if we have line of sight or not, and I'm going to temporarily set this to the start state just to test this. We'll unlock. We'll come over here. I'm going to lock my enemy AI in the inspector, again, just so that I can see if field of view, line of sight, and range are all reacting properly. And the one that I'm probably most interested in debugging right now is this line of sight. So I'll select that and lock this. I'll choose player, hit the play button, and I'm really just going to pay attention over here to what's going on. So when I go pretty far to the left, I'm out of the field of view, so that turns to false. I still have line of sight because there's nothing that's blocking my view, so we do have line of sight, although it is saying that our range was true. I guess it is true. The angle of view that I was looking at didn't look like I should have been inside that trigger, but actually it looks okay. So we're outside range, and we don't have line of sight. We now have field of view and line of sight, and now we're in range. So I'm watching all these switch just based on moving this around. So that's pretty good. Everything's working the way that we want it to. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to flip on. We'll use the range to determine whether our ray should be casting or not. So in other words, as long as we're outside of range, we're not going to cast a ray. And this is just a little bit of a tweak, a little bit of a refinement, and then we'll use some of that as something that we can build our behavior, some basic behaviors on.